So since January this year, the COVID-19 pandemic has once again brought zoonosis, or diseases that spread from animals to humans, into the limelight, attracting media attention and fueling public debate about the origins of the disease in animal hosts and the way and location of transmission or spillover of the disease from animals to humans. Today's roundtable brings together world-leading experts on zoonotic diseases from different disciplines and perspectives in order to discuss, disentangle, and hopefully unsettle our understanding of COVID-19 as a zoonotic disease. The roundtable is a result of a collaboration between the European Research Council-funded Centre for Global Knowledge Studies at the University of Cambridge and the Wellcome Trust-funded project, The Global War Against the Rat and the Epistemic Emergence of Zoonosis at the University of St. Andrews. And it brings in synergy the research interest of the two partners in exploring the formation of global epistemics around non-human animals from multi- and interdisciplinary perspectives. We hope that the presentations and the discussion will contribute to a better understanding of the zoonotic aspects of COVID-19, but also of the ways in which the pandemic has been zoonotically framed. So with no further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Lyle Fearnley. Lyle is a social anthropologist and assistant professor at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. He has conducted extensive research on bird flu biosecurity and disease surveillance in China, and in particular on wild fowl farms in Qinghai and on free grazing ducks in South China. His current research focuses on the ecology of health in contemporary Singapore, and his new book, to appear this October by Duke University Press, is titled Virulent Zones, Animal Disease and Global Health at China's Pandemic Epicenter. A very timely title. So, Lyle, good afternoon or good evening.
Thank you, Christos. Thank you so much for organizing, and really glad to be on this panel with the fellow speakers. As Christos was mentioning, one of the main debates the main sort of discussions around this pandemic has been about the origins. And I'm not going to talk about all of those debates, which have included conspiracy theories and so on. But what I'm going to focus on is on the claims about the origin of the virus in wild animals, and more specifically, the hypothesis that it came from farmed wild animals or wildlife trade. So the question about the origins of pandemics is really central to my book that Christos mentioned. And one of the things, so we all have thought about this in terms of, I think you've heard probably the idea of things like the geography of blame or stigma, or other claims, other ways of understanding the idea of identifying China and identifying wild animals and wildlife trade as a source of disease. And those have a lot of value. But one of the things that I tried to explore in my book was about what is the specific relationship of scientific research and scientific facts to those kind of claims. And I was never satisfied really with the sort of standard sociology of risk type argument, in which it's the idea is that there's just so much scientific uncertainty that the kind of those blame discourses are actually fueled entirely by a kind of sociological or moral argument rooted in a sociological need to find sort of a culprit or a scapegoat. And instead, I tried to understand what is the specific way in which certain kinds of scientific claims relate to those geographies of blame. And what I found in my research, which was looking at these arguments in the case of pandemic influenza, is really something about what I would call the molecularization of the environment and the role of the sort of excessive role of virological research in making arguments about the ecological origins of pandemics. So let me say a little bit about that. If we look at the history of influenza research and the claims about China as being a hypothetical epicenter of pandemics, that claim is actually rooted not really in ecological knowledge about China, but actually in virological research about laboratory research conducted largely by Robert Webster and others in the 1970s. So this image shows one of the research experiments he did, in which he took two different influenza viruses, swine influenza virus, which is actually also H1N1, the 1918 H1N1 virus, and then Hong Kong influenza virus, which is the 1968 pandemic flu virus. He infected two pigs and with those viruses, then placed those pigs with other pigs in an experimental setting. And he was able to show that those two viruses would actually reassort within the contact pigs that he's showing here. This is one experiment. He did many others with multiple different types of species. And so the result that he was, the result of this research was to show that basically that the emergence of new influenza viruses that create pandemics, it comes from interspecies contacts between different animal species who have different viruses, like a human influenza, a swine influenza, and an avian influenza. Now those results were then used to make an argument about China as being the place where those kinds of interspecies contacts would be happening. But actually there was very little ecological research being done at that time on the sort of actual species and actual farming practices. And I would argue that we're seeing a similar thing happening in the contemporary pandemic. So from the beginning, the claims about the origin of this virus from wildlife has largely been rooted in the, specifically in which species that it came from, has been rooted in the phylogenetic research done by, for example, by the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they showed that the current SARS coronavirus 2, which on this slide is in their paper, was called 2019 Novel Coronavirus, that it's most closely related to bat coronaviruses that they'd previously isolated, specifically bat coronavirus RATG13, as you can see there. What's interesting about this to me is that they make a claim about the phylogenetic relatedness between the viruses, and then that's used as a sort of is transposed onto an argument about a narrative about the origin, so that this came from bats originally, and but we don't actually have the ecological knowledge, sufficient ecological knowledge or cultural ecological knowledge about what practices actually brought that virus from bats to humans. And so instead that gets filled in with these kind of racist, xenophobic, or often misguided and false ideas such as bat soup or something like this that are actually false and unrelated to how the virus emerged. Okay, so what has happened is there's been a lot of discussion about this, again, in terms of the international response being like these kind of racist responses, and we saw from, the US government is using this in a very politicized way to try to sort of earn points. But there was also a critique of wildlife trade that was coming from within China. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit now. So even maybe before some of this even became very, got a lot of publicity internationally, scientists from the China Academy of Sciences published an open letter calling for elimination of illegal wildlife trade. And even by late February, China had instituted a permanent ban on wildlife trade and consumption. Now, a permanent ban on, or a temporary ban on wildlife trade certainly made sense, or was reasonable as a way of managing the immediate situation when there was little known about the source of, or how the virus was transmitted. But again, what I would say is that this idea of a comprehensive ban on wildlife trade is actually reflecting not so much, it's reflecting really the absence of the ecological knowledge and cultural knowledge of the interspecies relationships that brought this virus from bats to humans. So we have this virological knowledge of the fact that it's coming from bats, but we don't know how it happened. And the response has been just to prohibit all wildlife trade. And unfortunately, this has several problems with it. So during my fieldwork, here we go. Yeah, during my fieldwork, part of my fieldwork, I was doing research. I was studying the wild goose farmers in Poyang Lake, not Qinghai Lake actually, because that's Poyang Lake, which is now under actually severe flooding as well. You may have heard of it in the news. So it's a very large freshwater lake in Jiangxi province, and I was looking at these wild swan goose farmers, which in Chinese is called Da Yan. And they are, the swan goose is a wild goose species. It's actually the ancestral species of the Chinese domestic goose, but there's several features that are slightly different in the wild goose. So they don't have a pronounced knob on the top of the back of the bill, and they are a little bit smaller, have some different coloration, very slightly, and then really crucially, they can fly long distances. What I found in the fieldwork is that the farmers actually, when they raised them for periods of time, they often actually sort of degenerated or deteriorated and became more and more like domestic geese. And so for them, it was very crucial to try to breed them and raise them in ways to ensure they would maintain the wild characteristics. But this is one example of a species of animals that in China was regulatorily classified as wild, farmed, which in Chinese was referred to as special type husbandry, or 特种养殖. But what's interesting about that is that includes a very broad range of species, some of which have been farmed for centuries, frogs, some turtles, but it also includes swan geese, which were only really sort of farmed from the 1990s, and even things like tigers and bears would be included within that category. And so there's also very different kinds of husbandry practices that are involved in this. There's, for example, extremely intensive frog farms, which are actually mostly driven for the international frog legs trade, exporting to Europe and other parts of the world, not only for Chinese domestic consumption, and as well as much smaller and more specialty farming, like as you can see here. It's not a very intensive farm. So I would say that the risks for zoonotic emergence are actually extremely variable across this field of special type husbandry or wildlife farming. And again, the blanket ban is really reflecting a sort of inability to understand the complexity of the different kinds of risk relationships. what else was I going to say about this? How much time do I have, Christos? Do you have?
Around 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes left? Okay, great. Okay, then I'll just move to what I was going to finish with, which is that, well, okay, so one of the consequences of this fact that it was classified as special type husbandry is that it was not regulated under Ministry of Agriculture, but it's actually regulated under State Forestry Administration. And what's, I think, maybe important and relevant about that is that the Ministry of Agriculture has a very extensive veterinary apparatus. They have husbandry, farming extension training programs and disease surveillance programs, and they are really able to monitor and control diseases. I mean, they're doing a lot of training in that, and of course, it doesn't always work, but they're definitely doing a lot of training in that. And State Forestry Administration does not have that same kind of resources. And so it's an interesting situation where you have pretty intensive farming in some cases, but because it was classified as wildlife, it meant that it was not being managed under any kind of veterinary administration. And one example from my fieldwork is that, so poultry, China in 2005 instituted universal poultry vaccination for H5N1. That means every single poultry was supposed to be vaccinated. And it was, of course, not 100%, but they did vaccinate a lot of birds. But these that you see here would not be included in that program because they're considered to be wild and they were regulated under State Forestry Administration. They were not included. And as a result, they had extremely variable vaccinations. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. And they would not vaccinate according to the protocols that were set up by Ministry of Agriculture. So that was leaving a huge gap in the program because these are geese. I mean, they're essentially not very different from the domestic geese biologically. So it leaves me the question of whether some of the risk from wildlife trade actually has to do with the fact that it's not regulated with under any kind of veterinary administration, rather than it having to do with the specific species biology. That's just a question that is, I think, interesting. And then finally, I'm just going to finish. Yeah, so here's another species that was farmed there called spot-billed ducks. So Poyang Lake, it's described here as a model base for spot-billed ducks, another wild duck species. Okay, but what I want to finish is that recently, actually, the government, after the ban, the total ban on farming of wildlife, the new law states that only livestock, or chuqin, can be farmed legally in China. And so on April 8th, the Ministry of Agriculture issued this directory of what counts as livestock. And what's interesting here is that they have two categories. One is traditional livestock and poultry, which is the kind of animals that you would be expecting: pigs, cattle, sheep, goats, ducks, quail. But they also include a category now called special type livestock and poultry. And these are some of the animals that were previously included under that Tuzhong Yangzhi. It's now called Tuzhong Chuqin, but only some. So only a select few were actually migrated over and counted now as livestock. And these include sika deer, red deer, reindeer, mallard ducks, ostriches, silver foxes, raccoon dogs. And the argument and rationale for doing so is different in each case. So in sika deer, for example, it's described as being a traditional minority animal that's part of a minority group in China that has farmed it for many years. Where ostrich is because it's internationally been used and domesticated for a long time, so it's considered to be legitimate to categorize it this way. But so I think what we're seeing here is that this debate about what counts as wild and domestic, it's very very part of how the regulatory response to this epidemic is happening. And it's not, even though the claim was made of a blanket ban on wildlife, you immediately have the question of, well, what exactly does that mean? And how do we define that? So stuff.
Thank you very much, Lyle. I'm sure there will be many questions and great synergy with the other papers. Well, let's move on to our second speaker, Tamara Giles-Wernick, who is a social anthropologist and director of the Institute Pasteur's Anthropology and Ecology of Disease Emergence Unit, which has been recently founded. Tamara conducts research at the crossroads of ethnohistory and medical anthropology, investigating infectious disease transmission and global health interventions in Africa, and is also the PI of Sonar Global, which is an EU-funded network for engaging social sciences in the prevention and response of infectious threats and antimicrobial resistance. And Tamara's numerous publications, many in collaboration with scientists, have come to redefine the scope of collaborative medical anthropology in the field of zoonosis. Thank you very much for joining us, Tamara.
Thank you, Christos. I'm going to ask Samantha if you could post my slides. I gave them to her because I've been having difficulties actually showing slides from my computer.
I'm just having a problem with sharing them. I'll just be a moment, sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. Better you than me. But what I can actually be, you could just put it on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Thank you, Christos, for the invitation, and thanks, Lyle, for a really wonderful presentation. I learned a lot from that, and I think we have sort of, sympathetic views. I'm really coming from a perspective of someone who's worked with multidisciplinary teams to investigate zoonotic disease emergence in Central Africa. And so my presentation is really a set of what I would admit to be a set of loosely related reflections on what I've been mulling over these days, what's bothering me about discourses around COVID as zoonotic emergence and how that's been transposed to Africa, and how we have been approaching the question of spillover and emergence. Next slide, please. So I just want to begin by signaling my great appreciation for the work that all of the people on this roundtable have produced. I've been influenced by all of you in thinking about understanding of pandemics, spillovers, pandemic imaginaries, and the like. But I think all of you can better represent your work and its implications for COVID than I can. So my jumping off point is actually Janet Reutman's reflections on crisis, which I've actually found really useful for thinking through analyses of zoonotic spillover and COVID and what kind of bothers me about them. Reutman is interested in asking what kind of work crisis does. She argues that it's central to contemporary historical narrative, both as a kind of event, a moment, and an enduring condition, and calls it a non-locus from which one claims access to history and knowledge of history. She argues that crisis reduces analysis of a situation to one question, which is what went wrong, so that catastrophic events are the results of errors or aberrations from the normal operation of things, and directs our analysis away from daily normative practices and processes that bring about those events. So my question is sort of what kinds of questions are analyses of SARS-CoV-2 spillover asking? What kind of moral judgments are implicit in those? And what are they missing? Next slide, please. So with that in mind, I just want to sort of signal a couple of explanations. And I think that, Lyle was kind of referring to this as well in his presentation about zoonotic spillover and COVID. And not all of them explicitly invoke this term crisis, but they're fundamentally related to explaining spillovers in COVID as an ecological crisis. So what went wrong? And what bothers me is the kind of weird interchangeability that people see between an emergence and crisis, an emergence in China, as flawed as Lyle noted that was, and the kinds of human-animal viral interactions that we might be seeing in, or we think we're seeing in Central Africa. So the first is a publication in Proceedings of the Royal Society this year. It was picked up by the press and in fact invoked as an explanation for COVID in several media outlets. It identifies drivers of viral spillover by basically combining data on zoonotic viruses in terrestrial mammals, both wild and domestic. And again, we can question those categories, and puts that together with IUCN metrics on trends in species abundance with attention to animal species that are vulnerable, endangered, and very endangered. It's working on this kind of very global scale. Concludes that, exploitation of wildlife through hunting and trade, facilitates this contact, that anthropogenic activities cause losses in wildlife habitat quality, increases interactions, facilitates zoonotic disease emergence. Next slide, please. So, in the popular press, we see, these kinds of arguments getting picked up. Here, we've got David Quammen at the end of January in the New York Times explaining COVID, which is very much in the same vein as the previous publication, and asking where we went wrong. And, here he's talking about invading tropical forests, cutting trees, killing animals, disrupting ecosystems, shaking viruses loose from their natural hosts. When that happens, they often need a new host, and often we are it. So as if, these invisible viruses are somehow laying in wait for human beings to breach the frontiers of the forest. I'm reminded of some of Christos's work a few years ago here. But it's important to know that Quammen has produced several, and this is the historian side of me, what I would consider really objectionable books on the history of spillovers, on the history of HIV in Central Africa, basically making this same argument. And these are not isolated cases. I mean, Jane Goodall and many others have made similar cases out of COVID and kind of transporting this to Africa, as if these are the same situations and the same dynamics. Next slide, please. So what does the crisis help us to understand? I mean, first of all, yes, it's a very selective historical vision, focusing on the last several decades and displacing attention from much longer term interactions in, for instance, the Central African forest. All we need to do is look to the 19th century in Central Africa to know that there was significant anthropogenic change and near extinction events for certain species, notably elephants. It's also structured around an expectation of rupture, a kind of anticipation or hope in future change. And Romain Dudas, with whom I work at Institut Pasteur, sort of pointed out that, activists are also kind of signaling we don't want to return to the abnormal. So the crisis is kind of both a process of hyper-exploitation, hyper-mobility, and this pandemic moment, if we could call it a moment, is the ultimate expression of that abnormality. So the other sorts of issues that this ecological crisis, naming this an ecological crisis, overlooks is the drivers of viral zoonotic spillovers, like urbanization, deforestation, human-animal contact with its almost singular focus on hunting and butchering. These are really large categories. They're poorly defined. They do not attend to the kind of granular practices, relationships, and processes. And I would argue that we need a lot more of that. So here I would definitely, sort of side with Lyle on that point. And investigations that really sort of look to the very highly variable interactions between people and animals living where spillovers and emergences begin. What also might be interesting is to think about methodologies for accumulating these granular studies to meaningful regional conclusions. And I'm just going to punt that as a question in James's direction to see whether we could we could think about that. Other kinds of questions. Does viral sharing only have negative consequences? What happens when those dependent on wild meat are deprived of that access? And is the separation of humans and animals feasible as a biosecurity practice? You can already guess that my answer is no. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about two ways that my group and collaborators have been thinking and approaching these questions. The first is a project that is finished, but yes, we are still in the process of doing our analysis. This is a project that we conducted in southeastern Cameroon about relations between human beings and non-human primates. And the real foundation of that study was a kind of anthropological and historical investigation of changing relationships, ways in which people think, perceive, and interact with non-human primates. Because we felt that that kind of approach would sort of underpin, you know, when people decide to pull the trigger, for instance, or, you know, what it is that people are doing when they encounter these animals. And people talk about a really deep ambivalence that they have vis-a-vis non-human primates, although they recognize this kind of shared capacity to learn to express emotions. And when we went back and sort of collected, you know, during multiple extended visits, tales, oral histories, what emerged was a kind of framework, a long-term process that people articulated around a distancing that had been taking place for a very long time between human beings and non-human primates, punctuated by moments of intimate interaction, or you could call it contact maybe. These could be examples of interspecies aid, it could be periodic hunting, it could be animals engaging in crop raiding and attacks, but it also could be drumming and dancing parties that people claimed that their ancestors had with, for instance, chimpanzees. Then on top of that, we began to focus on a more quantitative approach, both a large-scale questionnaire as well as working in a participatory approach with and collecting 10 months of daily data on specific, about 21 people's activities, locations in the forest where they conducted those activities, and specific kinds of contacts that they had with 9 different species of non-human primates. And what we found was that those interactions were quite substantial. 85% of the people that we interacted with had specific physical contact with non-human primates through marketing, butchering, cooking, and eating 1 to 2 times a week. 50% hunted non-human primates at least 1 time a month. 19% of both formal and informal wild meat offtake came from non-human primates. And hunting and butchering practices were highly variable depending on the species and, of course, over time. So depending on what kind of animal one might kill, framed how much exposure different kinds of people had to the biological fluid. So for instance, monkey, there's a huge exposure across the board, women, adolescents, to those biological fluids. Now, niched within that, we were collected stool samples from both people, gorillas, and chimpanzees in the same area, used a control elsewhere in a European zoo. And our aim was to kind of look at gut virome and targeted viral sharing among these species, and to mobilize our social sciences approaches to explain what that sharing was about. And I can't put this up here because we haven't published it yet, and my collaborators would kill me if I did. But one of the things, to the great dismay of the virologists, was, oh, there are no bombshells. There's nothing in here that's going to basically devastate the world. But I actually think that's a really interesting result. And I think it's an interesting result because what we see is an enormous amount of spatial overlap between people and non-human primates, a lot of physical contact between people and non-human primates. And it made me wonder, certainly there were viruses that could get people sick, but it's not something that would necessarily kill them. And it made me wonder whether very long-term shared histories, shared resources, shared spaces in the forest may actually protect from devastating epidemics. Next slide, please. So we began to sort of, or we decided that we were going to kind of expand that approach with the Microtone project, which is still ongoing, to think about what people, domesticated animals and wild animals share across an ecological gradient. And I just want you to know I am not taking domesticated animals and wild animals for granted here. I mean, and actually, as you'll see, we see a lot of movement, but in DRC, in the Bolobo territory, people have very fixed ideas about what is and what isn't. So we're using, again, anthropological and historical investigation of changing human engagements, practices, understandings of animals. I'm just about finished. I've got maybe two more slides. Animal relative densities and mobilities, and trying to look at potential pathogens that are circulating in the ecological web. So we're really sort of in kind of a Tim Ingoldian sense, looking at a web of life. Next slide, please. We began with the kind of quantitative contact approach. And this is work that Thibault Langlois, who just finished an M2 with us, was responsible for analyzing. This is 5 months of contact and activity data from 25 volunteers across this ecological gradient. That is, I forgot to mention that it's 3 different villages, one which is located in an entirely deforested zone, another in a semi-deforested zone, and a third one in a zone where we know that forest cover has grown, has expanded over the last 50 years. So what you can see, we have indirect contact, and I'm sorry about the French here, but that's like, you know, if you see a footprint or a stool from an animal. Direct is where you saw the animal live, dead. Physical contact, that is, you touched the animal alive, you killed it, you butchered it, etc. So there's a fair amount of contact for our volunteers, but 2/3 of that is coming with domestic animals, and much of it sort of spatial overlap and not physical contact. What isn't shown here is that there is, in fact, a lot of contact through hunting, but that's not just a male activity. Women do trap, and they do it during their agricultural activities. So next slide, please. Here we kind of reverse the order. So we first collected the quantitative data, and now we're sort of, and then began to do participant observation. And particularly, I'm grateful for Romain Dudin and his important contributions here. And we were also doing interviews as well. And we're really in the process of analyzing. So this is going to be very preliminary. But what struck us was the place that dogs have in all of this. They are making material contributions to families, to their access to meat and protection. They're deeply involved in net hunting. So you can see a picture of that here. They consume body parts and blood at the hunting site. They have an enormous range, it would seem. And it seems to us that human, dog, and animal prey relations are sort of configured and do configure the gender, generational, and familial relations that we see, the symbolic meanings of killing, sharing, and consuming meat, and the effective relationships that exist between the hunters, their families, and dogs. So I'm not going to go into this because I've probably already talked more than enough time, but you know, we really see these dogs as a kind of critical node in this web of life, but also a really important, they have a really important place in microbial sharing, down to, you know, we've watched owners pre-masticate food for their dogs. So last slide, please, and then I'll stop. So just to end with a couple of points. First, in response to Christos's question for the webinar, is it possible for all of us to work together, for anthropologists and other social scientists to work with biologists and ecologists? I would say an enthusiastic yes. I've been doing so for about 5 years now and have found it hugely enriching. So I just want to sort of pop up a couple of points here. The first made by Vin Kim in a really superb collection on the anthropology of epidemics. About the species barrier should be thought of not as a firewall, but as a trading zone for genetic information. Absolutely. And this point has been made by many others, by Ibn Kirksey, who's talked about the COVID zoonotic spillover as a multi-species assemblage. David Napier, who made the point many years ago about the immune system is as much to assimilate difference as it is to defend us from the other. So that's, I think this is an important point to keep in mind. But at the same time, David Napier has noted more recently that what the social herd does, it's what the social herd does that moves viral information forward to advance our health and to make us sick. So viruses, I don't know. Viruses can both advance our health and make us sick. But I guess the point that I want to make is that what marks this pandemic and its scale and rapidity, I would argue, is not the zoonotic spillover. Arguing that we need to shut down wild meat markets and wild meat consumption is, if I might say, a diversion, an effort to foist off on highly marginalized populations, at least in Central Africa, the impossible costs of stopping zoonotic spillover. This is a distraction from the other kinds of crying needs that both people in lower and middle income countries and in wealthy countries, the recent first wave of the pandemic has shown. That is a need to invest in and train for more robust surveillance systems and healthcare facilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tamara, for this great talk. And it's absolutely fantastic to see how this whole problematization and research on contact has advanced methodologically, epistemologically. I think we spoke about this together for the first time 3 years ago at another CRASSH conference, and it's amazing to see how this has been developed, and looking forward to all these publications. Moving on to our third speaker is Frederick Keck, who is a social anthropologist and director of research at the CNRS since 2005, and also director of the Laboratory of Social Anthropology at the Collège de France. Frederick has carried out extensive ethnographic research on health crisis and biosecurity linked to SARS, avian, and swine influenza, and has published extensively on zoonotic diseases and disease surveillance, with his most recent monograph with Duke University Press being titled Avian Reservoirs, Virus Hunters and Bird Watchers in Chinese Sentinel Posts. And I'm very happy to have co-edited a volume with Frederick and Anne Kelly on the anthropology of epidemics, which has unfortunately proved to be very topical a year after its publication. So Frederick. Oh, you are muted. Shall I unmute you?
Thank you, Christos, for assembling such a stimulating forum in the middle of the summer. So I'm going to talk about the distinction between sentinels and whistleblowers, which is a conceptual distinction that I made after the COVID-19 crisis, but which I should have made before in my work on bird flu and SARS in Hong Kong. But the point I want to make is that precisely Hong Kong worked as a sentinel and a whistleblower during the previous crisis, whereas in this crisis there was a separation between sentinels and whistleblowers. And so there was this question that Tamara brought, what went wrong during this crisis. Many questions have raised about the question of the notion of preparedness. Was the world prepared to this pandemic? So in a sense, I want to argue that the world was prepared in the sense that Sentinels worked, but it was not prepared in the sense that there was not a good apparatus of whistleblowers in China. And so the problem is the transfer of Sentinels from Hong Kong to central China during this crisis. So the question I raise come from an anthropology of biosecurity, to which Lyle has contributed based on coming from an article that Stephen Collier, Andrew Lakoff, and Paul Rabinow published in 2004 on the notion of biosecurity as an apparatus of anticipation of disasters coming from the intensification of the circulation of living materials. And Andy Lakoff has published a lot with Stephen Collier about techniques of preparedness, which are techniques to anticipate the global spread of epidemics. And they showed that these techniques emerged after the Second World War, during the Cold War, and were transferred to global health after the end of the Cold War. The first of these techniques is Sentinel devices, which raise early warning signals of disasters. The second is simulations through worst case scenarios. And the third is stockpiling of priority goods such as masks, antivirals, or vaccines. We have had a lot of discussions on stockpiling during the course of this pandemic because there was a lack of masks. And now we come to the question of vaccines, and there were many controversies about antivirals. But at the beginning of the pandemic, there were many discussions on the early detection of the disease with the origins of the disease that Lyle talked about, which is the bat coronavirus. And in the special issue of the journal Limb with Andy Lakoff, we covered a series of figures of warning in which Sentinel devices is the ultimate figure. And so Sentinel devices are these techniques to anticipate disasters at the border between species, which is also a military technique. So the border between species is also a border, a military border, a border with the enemy. So how does that work in the context of Hong Kong through the different health crises that they have had to go through? So we still hesitate between COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 reminds the global opinion that the disease emerged. The disease in 2019 was very similar to the SARS disease emerging in South China in 2003, which was not as contagious as this one, but which was very lethal. As you can see, the rate of lethality was 10%. And in Hong Kong, where it spread globally to East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Canada, the lethality rate was even higher. And it was really a trauma in the public opinion in South China. The epidemic research showed that the disease came from wet markets, and Christos has worked a lot about the genealogy of this notion, where animals were butchered for many uses, but particularly Chinese traditional medicine. And there was a proof that those who butchered these small rodents, civet cats, were carrying antibodies to SARS. And that's the reason why the consumption of civet cats was forbidden, and the wet markets where these rodents were sold were closed. And another epidemic investigation showed that the virus was mutating among bats. This is an image that clearly illustrates the stigmatizing views that Lyle talked about SARS, the idea that Chinese consume bats in soup or in gastronomic delicacies, which is probably wrong. We have documents about traditional bat consumption in Southeast Asia or Australia, but not in China. But still, the chain of transmission from bats to civet cats was very well documented, and became a source of mobilization for future zoonotic diseases. Now, this is the team of Hong Kong University microbiology department that led all these investigations. The person in the middle is Malik Paris, who identified the coronavirus as the disease causing SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. And KY Yuan was the head of the microbiology department at the time, with a very high focus on biosecurity measures in wet markets. And Guan Yi was leading all the investigations on the animal origins of the coronavirus in civet cats, but also in bats. And because he was from mainland China, he could cross the border and get samples. So this team, where there's only one person coming from Europe, John Nichols, succeeded to a team of Australian microbiologists, Robert Webster and Kennedy Shortridge, who launched the Department of Microbiology of Hong Kong as a place to identify flu viruses in animals before they spread to humans and become pandemics. So it's important to remember that this team lost 2 weeks in February 2003, because they thought that the new coronavirus, that the new disease was actually caused by a flu virus. The symptoms are very close. But the fact that they lost time doesn't mean that they failed. On the contrary, it's because they were working on the hypothesis of an animal disease that they could, once they identified the coronavirus, they could track its animal reservoir in bats. So the scenario of anticipation of epidemics worked for coronavirus. It was the first time that the coronavirus passed from animals to humans, causing unpredictable immune effects. And so all the modes of reasoning that were applied to flu viruses were then applied after 2003 to bat viruses, which had been studied in Australia and Malaysia for Andra and Nipah viruses. So it was a high moment of convergence of different forms of virological reasoning. So this team was successful in working as a sentinel device to precisely track the animal origins of new respiratory diseases. Now, there were whistleblowers who were successful at that time. Two of them were very popular in the Chinese news. One of them was Zhong Nanshan. He was the head of the Guangzhou Institute of Respiratory Diseases, and he raised alarm on the new disease at the time when the Minister of Health in Beijing said that it was a known disease, that it was caused by bacteria, chlamydia. And he sent samples from patients in Guangzhou to the Department of Microbiology in Hong Kong so that they could do the analysis. So he was the first to speak loud against the official version of the Beijing authorities. And the second who spoke loud was Zhan Yangyong, who was the chief doctor at the military hospital in Beijing. And he sent a letter to Time Asia, a journalist of Time Asia, to warn him that the SARS patient in Beijing were hidden from the WHO authorities in trucks, and that the disease was actually spreading in Beijing much more rapidly than was officially recognized. And Jian Yannyong then became a hero because he was put under arrest for denouncing the repression of the Tiananmen Square movement. He had cured himself students from the 4 June movement, and so he made a connection between the silence of the Chinese authorities on SARS and the silence on the 4 June movement. And he received a peace prize, an international peace prize, for his mobilization, despite the fact that he was put under house arrest for several years. So Jian Yannyong is still considered as a dissident figure in China, but Zhong Nanshan, because of his role during the SARS crisis, has become one of the leading experts in China on the SARS-CoV-2, and he was with KYU, and he was one of the authors of the WHO report on February 28 that recognized the measures in China as strong and aggressive and efficacious, and giving them as a model to the rest of the world for the treatment of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question for me was how this distinction between sentinels and whistleblowers would work for the COVID-19 crisis. As you know, the SARS-CoV-2 emerged in 2019. Probably in South China, there are rumors and reports about first cases in the Guangdong province, but it was detected in Wuhan. And when the Hong Kong expert heard about this pandemic, they controlled the movements of people between mainland China and Hong Kong, the special administrative region, in a context where there had been a year of tensions between mainland China and Hong Kong. And you heard about the recent security law that represses 1 year of social unrest and student mobilization in Hong Kong. So this vocabulary of the fight against the virus was very strongly used by the Hong Kong government, even though Hong Kong was not at the epicenter of the disease at the time of the beginning of the pandemic. And as you can see, the number of casualties was very low in Hong Kong, and even in mainland China, if you compare it to the spread of the pandemic in the rest of the world, because of the strength of the measures of lockdown that were applied, and also of social control and social distancing. But the question at the beginning of the pandemic was really if Wuhan could become a sentinel post for pandemic preparedness in inner China in the same way as Hong Kong had been a sentinel post for SARS-CoV-1. And the reason why this question was raised is that the Beijing authorities built a laboratory in Wuhan after the SARS crisis with the help of the French Academy of Sciences, which is a biosecurity level 4 lab that can manipulate Ebola viruses, but also H5N1 and SARS, and that had a collection of bad viruses and major virologists in China working in this lab and in the Institute of Virology very close. And the history of Wuhan as a site of collaboration between Chinese scientists and Western investors is interesting to remember. In 1911, when the Chinese Revolution broke out, it was because the Chinese army revolted against the funding of the railroad by Western investors. So there was this tension at the beginning of the pandemic why the disease started in Wuhan, and whether the government of Xi Jinping could control this new source of tension. And actually, we can now say that Wuhan as a sentinel post worked pretty well, because the information was transmitted pretty quickly, as Lyle showed. The similarities between the new COVID-19 virus and previous coronaviruses circulating in bats were detected very quickly by Chinese scientists, and the sequence of the virus was sent all over the world in a quite good conditions of transparency and rigor. But there were here again 3 weeks that were lost before measures of lockdown were applied to the city of Wuhan and the province of Hubei, despite the fact that the doctors who were treating the first patients of SARS-CoV-2 had warned the authorities about the similarities between this disease and SARS, and particularly Dr. Li Wenliang, but also others. Dr. Li Wenliang became famous when he died on February 7, raising a wave of compassion and anger in the Chinese social media. So we can actually say that Wuhan worked pretty well as a sentinel post, but failed to work as a whistleblower, because the physicians were not heard. By contrast with the whistleblowers in the SARS, in the first SARS pandemic. So to conclude, I want to suggest this distinction between sentinels and whistleblowers as figures of warning, saying that the whistleblowers sends early warning signals to the public opinion in a kind of vertical mode, addressing the sovereign as a figure of decision on the crisis that has a possibility to end the crisis. Whereas the sentinel captures warning signals on the border between humans and non-humans in a more horizontal way, by extending the solidarity from human community to non-human beings. And this explains that the main distinction between whistleblowers and sentinels is that whistleblowers may have to sacrifice themselves if their early warning signals are not carried by intermediaries at the highest levels. And this is all the discourse about Li Wenliang and the doctors who have been repressed, is that they became martyrs of the pandemic, in the same way that Wuhan had to sacrifice itself to protect the rest of China. And this idea of sacrifice is really the idea of reduction of small beings to a higher cause, which is the health of the Chinese population, or even the reputation of China in the world. Whereas sentinels, and this is a major point that I make in my book on Sentinel Post, sentinels are not sacrificed. Even some of the sentinels die while raising alert. It is better for sentinels not to die, because they are constantly under surveillance for the mutations and the seroconversions that can be read on their bodies. And that signals are transmitted by a chain of actors who follow the mutations of viral information as it spreads through social networks. So that's the way sentinels are integrated in the human communities, by sending signals that are themselves transformed as they passed along the chain of actors. So this is a distinction that really became clear to me, and I hope that it becomes useful as a kind of analytic grid to understand the different ways to mitigate an epidemic at its very early beginning. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much, Frederic, and thank you for this great development on your notion of the sentinel with this figure of the whistleblower. It's anecdotically, it made me think, what does this make us do? Because I remember the exchange of our Happy New Year email on the 1st of January when we noted that there had been a small outbreak in Wuhan, wondering a bit jokingly whether this would be the next global pandemic, which I guess makes us some sort of thing, maybe a whistleblower to one another, but no more. Right, so moving on to our fourth and final speaker, James Wood is the Alborada Professor of Equine and Farm Animal Science at the University of Cambridge, and leading to numerous publications in scientific journals that have come to define the field. James's research focuses on infection dynamics and disease control, with a particular focus on epidemiological dynamics of virus infections of humans and other animals, including influenza, African horse sickness, canine rabies, and emergent Lissa virus and Henipavirus infections. James, thank you very much for joining us.
Christos, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a great privilege to speak to you today. I'm going to speak without slides today, hoping if I speak briefly, we can maximize the time for discussion. It's great to follow on from such a distinguished panel of speakers, and I hope that what I have to say is complementary rather than repetitive in relation to what they have had to say. I want to really focus on COVID-19 as a public health threat with zoonotic origins in my presentation, and really think to a very great extent, after a brief consideration of how we got to where we are, really think about what we might be doing next in order to try and reduce the likelihood of this sort of thing happening in the past. Lyle presented very clearly the evidence for this being a virus that has been derived somehow from a virus infecting bats. It may be some form of chimera between bat species, but we know that bats in the region, as indeed they do globally, live very closely together between mixing a variety of different species, which would facilitate easy cross-species transmission and therefore recombination between different viruses. And we know that coronaviruses can do this quite simply when you get co-infection in the same host. So I want to start off with very clear evidence that this is a virus that is derived from wildlife. Very likely, at some point, we don't know exactly when, a virus that was infecting a bat species or two or more. The other bit of certainty about the origins of this epidemic is that the first major cluster of cases occurred in Wuhan around the seafood market. And between at some point knowing that this was in a bat and some point knowing that the first observed and reported cluster of cases, not necessarily the first case, but the first reported cluster of cases was around this so-called seafood market, even though there was far more than just seafood there. And there were clearly erroneous reports with wild speculation going on through December and January, suggesting that they might have even been selling species as diverse as koalas there, which clearly they weren't. And this touches on the xenophobia that frequently surrounds this sort of discussion that Tamara commented on, and I think that we'd all agree with. That emergence of that cluster of cases may simply have been because there are an awful lot of people that used to go to Wuhan seafood market. So if you're going to be a new infectious disease cropping up in humans, what a great place to go, meet new hosts. It speaks nothing to whether or not it actually transmitted from animals to humans for the first time in that area. It may well be that that was where it took off as an epidemic in humans before it became this global pandemic. And actually, we have no idea, as has been suggested, how this got there, whether this was direct from bats to humans, whether this was because someone ate undercooked bat in their stew, unlikely by the way, which range of intermediate hosts, whether pangolins were involved in some way or not, whether wildlife trade was involved going into that region or not. These are things that actually, despite the fact that there is an ongoing WHO investigation there, all we are likely to be left with following that type of investigation, and I'm sure many that follow it, is a long list of this is what might have happened. And actually, for what appears to have been in stark contrast to the SARS coronavirus outbreak, where there was multiple spillover over an extended period from palm civets into humans through traded palm civets, this appears to have been a one-off event. And the likelihood of us finding a smoking gun is extraordinarily small. I'm not sure that that matters in terms of determining what we should do next, but I think it's very important to recognize what we do know and what we don't know. Since then, there's been a great deal of focus on wildlife trade, on wet markets. And by the way, wet markets in a clear definition would include that fantastic French greengrocer on the market in Cahors that I went to a couple of years ago, just as they would the fishmonger in my hometown of Newmarket. A wet market is not just something that is filthy in a faraway place that has live animals in it. I think we have to focus absolutely on what parts of how we manage animals and deal with animals that may pose undue risk, and not come up with blanket statements that we think would sound good when printed on what for Britain would be the front page of the Daily Mail or some equivalent newspaper or website in whichever country we live in. What we need to do is focus on the things that really are associated with real risk. And I think one area that I think there is clear benefit in us thinking about focus on is the international trade in live animals, particularly when we are mixing species, and probably particularly focusing on the international trade in wild and live animals, the international trade. This is something that which is exploited by many. There's a huge business, but I think that we need to look very carefully at banning or regulating it in a way that is feasible locally, and all regulations or changes like this, if they are to be workable, must be culturally and nationally relevant and specific. This must not just be some diktat from talk in Cambridge or an office in Geneva that says this has got to end and then it all ends, because actually the big risk there, and we must think about unintended consequences of actions, is that you drive a lot of things underground, and then you make them riskier and far harder to regulate, and also then often bring in even more criminal underpinnings than you might have already. So things to consider about with this coronavirus in terms of how we react to it. We have seen that it can behave to an extent as a reverse zoonosis, and there are a handful of dogs and cats and zoo animals that have been infected, which I don't think are of any particular consequence in terms of the epidemic. The species that has been the worst affected has been the mink farms of the Netherlands, and a very big one in Spain, where there does appear to be quite widespread and easy transmission, and transmission probably back to cats and to farmers as well. So this is something that can get from humans into other animals, but doesn't appear to be an issue in relation to food animals and farmed animals that we eat, or pet animals. These are the common sort of pets that we might particularly care about, the dog and the cat. So, but then what should our next responses be in relation to research in order to minimize the risk of this sort of thing happening again? Many of my colleagues in the natural sciences are calling for us to investigate and sequence and characterize every virus that ever exists in wildlife. From there, they claim that we will make a vaccine that will work and will sit on the shelf to protect us from any virus in any wildlife species ever. Problem is that we can't even come up with a vaccine yet that protects against flu. Well, we've got a pretty good idea what's going to be the next flu virus in the next season, with a minor change, and we still can't even make those vaccines work. But suddenly, because of an injection of cash, we're going to be able to do this for all viruses, in all families, from all species of wildlife and farmed animals. I am concerned that that's dishonest, if not just overly optimistic. I think it's just dishonest to claim that. I think that what we need to think about are the human behaviors that drive these pandemics, not the infections that actually are maybe the primary cause. Actually, the real thing that causes these pandemics is the way that us as humans behave. I think that it's possible that finding out much more about viruses that exist around wildlife can be a good thing in other species. But I think it might be much more useful in terms of thinking about generic treatments rather than necessarily a generic vaccine where we're going to stimulate this most amazing cross-reactive immunity against everything that we haven't yet discovered. When we think about infectious disease control, and I think that we've seen this in the variation in control success between different countries. And I've been teaching infectious disease control, which is much more of an issue in veterinary medicine than it is in human medicine, where because we think very actively about disease management in animals. The most important thing that I teach students every year is intervening early before the case numbers get high, before resources get overwhelmed. I believe firmly in that principle for disease in all species. And if we take that to its logical conclusion, then the thing that is most important to invest in is early diagnosis, primary health care, and public health. And that would be particularly in the case where many infectious disease pandemics are likely to arise based on prior history. And there are maps which are somewhat contested, but accepted as likely generalities, with hotspots being in parts of the tropics in both across Asia, Central America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that if we really want to prevent these sorts of pandemics arising, then we should learn about early intervention from early diagnosis. And a huge benefit of investing properly in primary healthcare in some of the poorest parts of the world is that there are huge knock-on public health benefits and social advantages that would follow from that, which can be done in a locally constructive and relevant manner. I think we need to think very much about the trade and movement of live animals. If you have a piece of meat, the likelihood of a virus persisting in it, particularly an RNA virus persisting in it, is rather low, particularly after the meat has set, after rigor mortis has set in. Other viruses may persist a little bit better than some of the most common ones. If we, however, we have living animals that are stressed, then they can get infected with other viruses. They can infect others with their viruses they're already carrying. It's much, much riskier. And so I think that really focusing on trade and movement of live animals is something that we need to think about in terms of nationally relevant regulation. And that has to be done in a thoughtful way that is relevant for each country, not something that, as I said earlier, that is imposed internationally. It's critically important, in my view, that we do not remove the primary protein sources from indigenous peoples who have harvested wildlife for as long as they have lived where they live, be it hundreds or thousands of years, depending on where they are. Typically, it's not the indigenous people who may live off bushmeat, or however you wish to describe it, but certainly live off wild animals. These are not the people who are producing the pandemics. But in fact, they are the best conservators of the natural ecosystems that they have always lived in. And if we do more to protect them and their land rights, we'll do a lot more to protect ourselves from pandemic threats, rather than thinking about throwing them off the land and turning them into illegal poachers or shooting them if they're ever to go on a tiger reserve. I think that how we behave as humans is the major determinant of whether or not we will see the next pandemic, or whether we can stop it in its early stages before it spreads. just as we try to do for Ebola, which thankfully is not as transmissible as SARS coronavirus 2. This is an important zoonosis, and I think it's really important that we use the momentum that comes from this pandemic to try and come up with rational measures to try and combat this. A lot of this is not, in my mind, going to be about technical biomedical advances, although that will be very important in terms of improving treatments and vaccines for this virus that has arisen. But it's going to be much more about thinking about human behaviors and economics in order for us to work to turn this world into a safer place that is less at risk from this sort of pandemic, whose risk is undoubtedly enhanced by the increasing globalization that is a feature of the world today. So it's not a very natural sciencey, virology, epidemiological talk from me, but I think it's really important for me that we recognize what we can do and what we should do and what we should do next. And what I probably should have started with is an apology for my slightly strange posture. I've been somewhat laid out with a bad back and rather struggling with sitting and standing. So yeah, please excuse the rather strange position you see me in today. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much, and especially for giving a talk when you must be in pain. But thank you above all for this very
drugs, not pain.
rich talk about COVID, and I think personally, and I think everyone else, I would like to thank you for not keeping these opinions and these ideas to the closed corridors of Wolfson or Cambridge or whatever, but actually very much expressing them in public. It has been many times, especially during the early months of the January, February, when I was reading things in the news about the zoonotic origins of the disease, and I was desperate. And then you made an intervention, kind of framing things in their proper kind of scientific dimensions, and that was a great relief, actually, reading these interventions. So thank you for that. And if I may ask a question, a general question for everyone to begin with, before we move on to the questions from the audience, and if you can respond quickly, say in a minute or two each. I know this is kind of challenging. And in which ways do you think that this pandemic has confirmed or actually troubled our anticipations of zoonotic emergence? James, you can go first, if you like.
So in many respects, this is exactly what we might have predicted. Putting to one side the fact that this may not have come from the Wuhan seafood market, say it did come from that market. Now, this is a market that's got mixed species, some of which were alive when they were being sold and mixed. We know it's an area where there's quite a lot of, there has been quite a lot of wildlife trade into the market. It's a part of the world where there's a huge amount of people mixing, mingling, and moving. And so you've got all of the recipes for a perfect takeoff of a global pandemic. The one thing that none of us would have predicted after the start of SARS coronavirus is the bravery and quality of the Chinese scientists in the first 6 weeks who reported this as a novel clinical picture, grew virus from it, and published the sequence of virus by the 24th of December in a way that allowed vaccine production to start on Christmas Day globally. And that's why we are as far ahead as we are, however far that is, we don't know whether they're going to work or not, with vaccine production. And I think that the bravery and openness of those Chinese scientists in the early stages of that pandemic was not something that many of us would have predicted. And I think it is always worth noting and celebrating. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Frederick?
I would say that this pandemic has confirmed the scenario of the zoonotic origins of pandemic. but that it troubled the notion of mixing vessel, because as Lyle showed, the hypothesis of pig for avian influenza was proved in the 1970s. And in the SARS crisis in 2003, there were antibodies of SARS found on butchers in the markets of the Guangzhou province, and also viruses found on civet cats. So the idea of a transmission from a reservoir to a mixing vessel or vector species was very clear. And I think that the pangolin hypothesis has been a diversion because the Chinese government needed to act on pangolin trade, but that we still haven't had clear ideas about what the mixing species were for this zoonosis.
Thank you, Frederick. Tamara?
I think that the pandemic, in many ways, I would agree with both Frederick and James that it has, in many ways, confirmed what was expected. You know, and particularly as someone who's studied both histories of influenza as well as HIV, you know, there's a lot that seems to me that was expected and has come to pass. One of the things that bothers me that has come to pass is that many of the same kinds of alliances, I would say, between, and it's not clear to me where it's coming from, but alliances between virological analyses of zoonotic emergence, in this particular case, echoes the alliances between, you know, sort of these virological analyses and conservation efforts, so that conservationists tend to kind of hijack this as a way of saying, look, you know, what we're doing is actually saving people's lives. I think very quickly where this has actually troubled what we expected is that for all of the rhetoric and shall I say, money that's been put into apparent preparedness, there are a number of places across the globe that were decidedly not prepared to handle the number of cases that we've seen.
Thank you, Tamara. Lyle?
Yes, yeah, I'd like to build on also what James was saying about these plans that have been developed over the past several decades to sort of do this massive sequencing and develop vaccines or some kind of countermeasures as a result. And I think some of you might recall there's a paper that was written maybe in 2014 called Prediction and Prevention of the Next Pandemic, Zoonosis. And I think what's really incredible about this outbreak is that it's not only that it confirmed the zoonotic narrative of pandemics, but this is specifically predicted. And there was a lot of research on coronaviruses, bad coronaviruses in China by international, but also by Chinese researchers. And they were saying, literally, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. But prevention, we weren't even close to what was needed to do prevention. Not only, there's no idea, like we can't develop a vaccine now, even after several months. But not only that, the idea, what needs is a different strategy, as I think we've all been talking about engaging with transforming some of the kind of ecological conditions.
Thank you, Lyle. Thank you very much. I'll ask the first question I've got privately. I think it's a question for
Christos. Can I just make one further comment? Because
yes,
I think Tamara made a really important point about conservationists' reaction to this. And the point that I would make is that there is much diversity in conservation. Actually, there's not very much diversity in conservation. It's nearly all white. There's a huge heterogeneity in the attitudes of conservationists, and some see conservation as being 30% of the world without any people in it, but lots of animals. Other people who are taking an anti-colonial stance, and that is principally an eco-fascist colonial stance, I would postulate. Other people see people as being at the heart of conservation, living in the ecosystems that they are a key part of. And I think that, and those people will continue to live closely with the animal species that they have always lived closely with, and will not be harvesting them unduly because of the more natural way they've tended to hunt them. And I just think it's really important to make the distinction between the land grabbing colonial conservationists from those that are committed to try and help the people who have always lived in natural ecosystems continue to live there.
I think that's a really important point, and I should thanks for calling me out on that. In fact, in the area that we're working in DRC, on one hand, you have the World Wildlife Fund, which is land grabbing, and very top down. But at the same time, there's also a locally created NGO Momentour that it's homegrown, and their interest is actually in protecting bonobo populations, but using those bonobo populations for a kind of economic development of this very poor part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I would agree with you.
Thanks, Tamara. No, I passionately think it's a really important distinction we must make.